Moving on to Japan, we have the Hero Sha. The Hero Sha is a simple SPG. Basically, you take a Rogue Go, you chop off its turrets, you keep it open-topped, and you add 120mm from it from the 1800s. And you know, that's basically what you do. The muzzle velocity being 530 meters per second on it. This thing had negative 12 degrees of gun depression, so you could sit it on a hill. It also had a 6-cylinder engine with 290 horsepower, and overall you can see it's definitely a beefy boy. And if we're talking about Japanese SPG, there aren't a ton of options, but this one would be a little bit of fun at rank 1 alongside the Rogo, which I believe is still the least used vehicle when it comes to the game. The other option, which is a little bit more palatable for most people, is the GSR 105 tank. Now this was a prototype tank, which was designed after the kind of failure of the Type 60 recoilless, little gun carriage thing that we have in game. In 1978, there was a project in Japan to build an infantry fighting vehicle, which led to 2 prototypes. You had the B-78 and the Model 89. So this used the chassis of the B-78 IFV prototype, and Japan developed a tank destroyer equipped with a new 105mm cannon that opted with a minimal recoil, so basically pretty much a recoilless rifle in it. The trials were favourable, but the prototype was not accepted as the need for a tank destroyer was no longer in demand. So this machine is a very low profile chassis with a very low profile gun on it, and has actually been touted as a machine which could replace the whole reproduction if they ever wanted to take it out of the game under the guise that it never truly existed. So I think overall it definitely is a good shout for a Japanese SPG, and since there are limited options for Japan in the SPG department, it wouldn't be too bad to go for. Now let's go a little bit crazy. So heavy cruiser, heavy cruisers for Japan. You have so many of them, and obviously a lot of them didn't survive the war, but a lot of them were incredibly powerful. So let's talk about one which I think is the next step when you compare it to the other heavy cruisers for Japan, and then we'll talk about one which would be absolutely bonkers to add. So the Megami is the first one we're going to talk about. It's a Japanese heavy cruiser which had access to 15 155mm guns, 8 127s, 12 Type 93 torpedoes, 4 40mm. So overall, that was its initial idea. So 15 155 guns in 5 sets of triples, and 8 127s in 4 sets of 2s. So you can see it was pretty heavily armed. But the final actual armament on this machine was 6 200mm guns, 8 127mm, 30 25mm, and 12 Type 93 torpedoes. Now what lets it down is the belt. It's got a belt of 125mm, which isn't crazy strong compared to a few of the vehicles that we have in game. Still up there, but it's not incredibly strong. And also, on top of this, its speed is 69 kilometers an hour, so it's still quite a fast machine overall. So the Megami is looking nice when it comes to the next step for heavy cruisers for Japan. I think personally it's another 1930s monstrosity that the Japanese made, which unfortunately was sunk in 1944 after being hit in the Battle of the Surigao Strait against the Americans. Now that would be the sensible choice if we just wanted a little bit of power creep. The non-sensible choice, or unsensible choice, or crazy choice, let's say, would be the Kinugasa. Now the Kinugasa was part of the Aoba class of heavy cruisers. It was actually launched in 1926, but what we're going to talk about is its final actual load of what it was built for. So as it was built, it had 6 200mm guns. So we're talking about big guns on this. So in sets of dual mounts, you had 6 of them. On top of it, you had 4 120mm. Then you had 12 torpedo tubes. But when you look at its final size, what you have is once again these 6 200mm in sets of duals, 4 127mm, 8 24-inch torpedo tubes, and 50 25mm, 25mm AA guns. 50 of the damn things all over the place would be incredibly fun. It also only has a belt of 76mm of armor and a deck of 36mm, so it's not crazy armor once again. Speed of around about 67 kilometers an hour, but look at the amount of AA on this machine. 50 25mm, and yes, it's clip-fed AA, but still, that's insane. There's no way anything gets close to that. And with the main guns that it has, these 6 200s, they should be able to put a lot of holes in a lot of things. So the Megami is looking incredibly good with its 155s or 200s, but I just really like the AA capability of the Kinugasa, which I believe could both be very useful in the game and also just fun to play. The next vehicle we're going to talk about is, of course, the Germans. So they're touted for getting some heavy cruisers. Now, the heavy cruisers that the Germans had, see, this is the problem in War Thunder, right? We're going to start running into areas where nations are going to start dominating others, and that's just because of different specifications of machines. I've already talked about, some crazy ideas in this, the Lightning, the MiG-21, machines like this, but when you look at ships, it gets even worse, because the Germans kind of skipped the idea of what would be known as a general heavy cruiser and went straight towards what would be known as I suppose a pocket battleship in a way. So you take a smaller machine than a battleship, but try and fill it with as many guns as possible, so you could do a ton of damage to stuff. So we're going to talk about the Admiral Hipper class here, which I think is the next logical step for cruiser, unless you want to add in the Deutschland class. That would probably be a better one to add, but I know for a fact that the Hippers are the ones that everybody has talked about, and also the Hipper class has slightly smaller guns than the Deutschland class, which is why we're picking it here. So the Admiral Hipper class, and we're going to focus on the Admiral Hipper, which was the lead ship of the class, were incredibly strong machines. Unfortunately, there was 5 planned, 3 completed, 2 were cancelled, one of them, the Lutzlow, which was sold to the Soviets, but the Admiral Hipper, the Blucher, and the Prince Eugen, which is probably the most well-known one since it was the one which was nuked in 1946 by the Americans during testing, and it also survived the war, which is a very large thing when it comes to it. But the fact is, these are incredibly well-known for the fights that they had in World War II, and also it would just be kind of a surprise if eventually these don't come to the game. So let's talk about the armament of your general Admiral Hipper class, or the Admiral Hipper itself. So 8 203mm, 12 105mm, 12 37mm, 8 20mm, and 12 torpedo tubes with a belt of 80mm overall. Now, if you talked to me about a year ago about, should this be added to the game, what is the chances of this added to the game, I would have been probably around about 0.5%, not high really at all. But with the expansion of what we're seeing from the American light cruisers, where they're going for a hell of a lot more, rate of fire than anything else, then we have the British light cruisers, which are becoming, well, not incredibly strong now, but they have a lot of armor and they have a lot of firepower behind them. Then you're looking at the Japanese moving into heavy cruisers. I think the Admiral Hipper eventually will come pretty soon. So, with its 203s, it will be incredibly fun to use. And if we're talking about what other heavy cruisers you can add, it makes much more sense to me than the Deutschland class, which was the vehicle that came out actually before. the Admiral Hipper. So let's just talk about the Deutschland class so you can get an idea for this machine. It has 6 280mm in triple turrets, so 2 sets of 280s. It has 8 150s, 3 88s, 8 torpedoes as well. Then it has around about 80mm of belt, but the main issue is around its main guns, the 280s. It has 140mm worth of armor, and that is the biggest problem when I think about this machine. The fact that those guns, they're going to have a pretty low fire rate. You know, they're going to they're not going to you know, they're not going to fire a lot, but once they hit, they're going to do a ton of damage, and on top of this, it's going to be very hard to knock them out because of the armor that's sat around them. So what we have here is just an insane machine, which is going to be really fun to play and also really fun to fight against. So yeah, this would be seen as the first of the pocket battleships, whereas the Admiral Hipper class would be seen as a continuation of it. Now the next one is the helicopter idea for the Germans. Now obviously we know it's going to be the Eurocopter. We know already the Germans have one planned, so do the French. The French have 2 planned, the Germans have 1. And so yeah, it's as simple as that. Let's move on to from it, since we've already talked about it. The Italians are getting a bunch of different things, which is kind of a surprise, but would be a welcome one. The first one is a medium tank. So this is where it gets interesting, because if we have a look at World War II, there aren't a lot of medium tanks left for Italians. And yes, I know a lot of people are going to bring up planned vehicles or prototypes that weren't built or wooden mock-ups or whatever. But if we're talking about vehicles that were built, the only one you've really got is the Fiat M1643, which was a prototype medium tank in 1943. It was designed after the ideas of the BT5 and the A13. It had a 47mm on it, and the armor was only 30mm on the front. So the main reason it was built is because it was fast, you know, 55 kilometers an hour, but it never really got off the ground as a project because, well, 1943 was pretty close to the armistice, and Italy were very much losing the war. It was also an incomplete prototype, so they never fully finished it, but I think it's definitely closer than something like the P-43 BIS, which I've seen a lot of people clamoring for, even though it didn't exist at all. The next idea to bring on the books is a Leopard. We know for a fact that the Italians used Leopards. They used Leopard 1A1s and 1A2s, and I'm sure other subsequent versions as well, but they actually built some of their own. So Otto Melara, you gotta love them. Otto Melara, which don't actually exist anymore. They merged with another company, or were bought out by another company in 2015. They are responsible for a lot of the manufacturing of vehicles for the Italian armed forces. And during the time of, obviously after World War II, Otto Melara built some M60s, they also built some Leopards, and they built a bunch of other things as well under licensed contract. And after the Germans gave the Italians 200 Leopard 1A1s and 69 Bergpanzers, which are the recovery vehicles for, you know, the Bergpanzer 2, which are kind of recovery or all-purpose vehicles, like engineering vehicles that you can use. The vehicles were designed to replace the M47s, and then a further 600 Leopard 1A2s and 67 Bergpanzer 2s were built in Italy by Otto Melara, with deliveries starting in 1975. So you had this initial batch of Leopard 1A1s given to them by the Germans, and then they got a license to actually build the Leopard 1A2s. The problem with the Leopard 1A2s, though, because at least from what I've read, is for the German Leopards, the Leopard 1A1 onwards all had stabilizers. They had at least a 2-plane stabilizer, whereas the Leopard 1A2 for the Italians, they were built without stabilizers and without side skirts. So this could actually make it different from the ones that you have in the German tech tree, because you could put it at a lower BR, maybe around 8.0 or 8.3, and give it, you know, the fun round that you want to. But at the same time, it would mean that it would be different, at least, from a German Leopard. So The fact is, you could either go M16 or you could go Leopard 1A2 and stick it in the Italian tech tree. The next one is a ZSU or an AA. The two options for this, in my opinion, are either the Draco or the Saddam. So we'll do the Saddam first because it's the easiest, and also probably not the one that we're going to guess because it technically didn't exist. So we have the Saddam 25 in game. Now yes, that existed, right? You know, in its current iteration in game, it did exist, but there was a planned variant for it, or an upgrade, which had its mounting Matra Mistrals. So I'll read it for you. As of early 1997, the only specific modernization and retrofit program for the Saddam 25 has been related to the integration of the surface-to-air missile system. In late 1994, studies were begun by the contractor of the possible integration of the Matra Mistral light anti-aircraft missile system. The envisioned configuration has 2 launcher packs, each containing 3 missiles mounted on the turrets. Above each, a bank of 2 cannon. In this proposed program, the cannon would be used for close-in engagements, with the missiles used for longer engagements. The only other modernization and retrofit potential specific to the Saddam 25, as it presently exists, are in relation to possible upgrades to the fire control state. However, any effort in this area is not expected until the early years for the next century at the earliest. So there we go. As you can see, the actual idea of adding Matra Mistrals was there, they just never did it. So therefore, adding them to it would not really make a lot of sense since it never existed. The other one is, of course, the Draco, the Hellspawn, as it will be known if it ever comes to game. You take a Centauro chassis, you marry it with a modified automatic turret, and what you get is the Draco. So this thing was designed to pretty much just annihilate anything that is around it, including air, REM, or surface targets, and it was just good at pretty much everything. It has ammunition out the wazoo to pretty much be used for anything with its 76mm gun. They also mounted this on a ship, and actually many different ships, so we could see this in a different version as well. I've actually talked about the Draco in the past for consideration video, and there's actually a lot of information on it, which is incredibly nice to read about. But you know, it pretty much has access to every single type of ammunition in the world because the Italians really believe in this thing, and for good reason. You know, it's a high firing, high penetration, or even, you know, high explosive mass machine, which seems to do everything that they need it to do. So therefore, why not stick it, you know, in the game at some point, and maybe when we expand the BRs, you can see this thing flying around just like the automatic does. The next set of things is interesting for the Italians because, well, there are 2 fighters and 2 interceptors. And the problem with this is this is where personal bias is coming in personally, because the fighter, I hope, is the RE 2005 Sagittario, or the Reggiani 2005. It was the last of the Reggianis that were made in World War II. It was seen as the pinnacle of development for this, and if it ever truly got off the ground, to be a really, really nice fighter. It had access to 2 12.7mm Breda Safats, 1 20mm in the nose, and then 2 20mm in the wings, alongside an engine which was, of course, German. The engine itself was a license-built DB605. So I know a lot of Italians are going to get annoyed at me for calling it German, but it's a license-built one. So the fact was, this was based off the DB605A-1, which gave it around about 1455 horsepower, but the actual name of the engine itself was the Fiat RA 1050 RC58 Tifone, or Tifone. So even though this thing has a lot of German stuff in it. It has the MG151s, it has the, you know, the engine, it has a lot of design decisions taken from stuff like the C205, and also from, you know, the it also from a lot of German aircraft, it still is Italian. It still should be seen as Italian since it was produced from 1942 to 1944, so it was produced before the armistice and therefore should be seen as so. So I can't wait until this becomes the gem of the Reggiani part of the tree. And for me, I've talked about it many times on the channel. I'm very much looking forward to it being there as an impressive machine. The Interceptor idea is an interesting one, which is why I've also picked an interesting aircraft, the Imam RO-57. This is a twin-engine Italian plane, just like there's no heavy fighter for Japan, unfortunately, in this list. But why not throw in some kind of twin-engine machine for the Italians? So it's based on a 1939 design by Giovanni Galasso, and the aircraft didn't enter production until 1943, and they made around 50 of them. Now, the main issue with the RO-57 was that even though it was all metal, even though it had a pretty decent amount of guns on the front instead of two 12.7s, it could also maybe carry, two MG151s, which would easily make it competitive in the game. The problems that it had was, of course, once again, the engines. The engines themselves were Fiat A74 RC38s, 14-cylinder air-cooled radials, with only 840 horsepower per engine, meaning that moving it around, not exactly the easiest thing to do. They did make a BIS version, though, which fitted a bunch of different things, so you could definitely have that coming into the game, but I think just the RO-57 in general would be the logical idea for an interceptor. Now let's talk about one for the Italians, which could really open a can of worms, since many nations use this machine. The second interceptor I want to talk about is the F-104. Now, the F-104 was a machine that the Americans used, the Germans used, obviously the Italians used. It was very much spread out around the place, and there was even the one that I want to talk about is the F-104S, which was a licensed production Italian version of the F-104 Starfighter. So therefore, you could have this machine, and it would at least be seen as something which would be Italian, even though, it was used by a lot of different nations. So, if you want to know the different nations it was used by, we're talking about Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Netherlands, Norway, Pakistan, Spain, Taiwan, Turkey, US. So, the majority of nations in the game could get some form of F-104, but because of the fact that there was a license-produced Italian version, I think it would be lovely to see it's in the game just for that reason. The F-104S does look incredibly nice when it comes to the Italian skin as well. It has access to a 20mm Vulcan in the nose with 725 rounds, and it could also go Mach 2.2 as its never exceed speed. So once again, it's in the area of the Lightning, it's in the area of the MiG-21 that we talked about, so it would be a perfect fit alongside all the other stuff that we've discussed in this video. It also had a bunch of hardpoints, a ventral for a 900 kilo, and also lateral for the fuselage and underwing and internal, and also wingtips. So pretty much it is a modern fighter. It was designed to have as many hardpoints as possible, and it could carry AIM-9s, AIM-7s, and a bunch of different bombs, and even napalm, just to really put the cat among the pigeons. So if we want to talk about it in game, it would be incredibly nice to see. I know once again it would annoy a lot of Americans to see, but sometimes you gotta make sacrifices just to try and give other nations some nice toys. Moving on to the French. So as you can see, a lot of stuff for the Italians. Moving on to the French, the last two things, we have a medium tank. Now, unless you want to go like pre-World War II or very early World War II, there isn't a lot to add to the French tree in the form of medium tanks, apart from one machine, which is of course the AMX-32. The AMX-32 was a prototype which was designed off the ideas of the AMX-30, and they used a bunch of the ideas from the AMX-32 in the AMX-40, which came after it. It was supposed to be mounted with either the 105mm gun or the 120mm smoothbore gun, and it was optically stabilized, so not a standard stabilizer that we have in the game, but it basically means that it has a different stabilization system, but it could definitely work as a stabilizer in game if they ever added it in. It also had the 20mm that we're very much used to, and it was designed for export, like a lot of these AMXs were, but unfortunately just never got off the ground. No one really wanted to buy it, and it was seen as not enough of an improvement over the AMX-30s, so they decided to improve the AMX-30s and also work on better tanks such as the AMX-40, which eventually also became an export vehicle. So on top of that, that is really the only French medium tank that is really left that you could add. The other one is a helicopter, and as we know, it's the Eurocopter, right? We know that the Eurocopter is coming to the game in the next update, so that would fit that bill as well, meaning that that is the end of the list. So there's a lot of cool and interesting ideas here. You know, I could definitely see an update with all of these vehicles. I don't think this would be a full list, though. I think there would be much more stuff which would be involved, and also at the same time, there's no mention of British helicopters, there's no mention of the German replacements, there's no mention of anything like that, so therefore it would be kind of a surprise if this was the full list compared to what we're actually going to get. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, looking at some speculation and having a bit of fun. I hope you get a little bit of a taste of some of these vehicles and research some of them yourself, because it's definitely a hell of a lot of fun. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Mopar 1969, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyans Terry, and Elove Goats, and of course Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.